The sunset settled over Red Bluff in a deep red hue, thick as the last pages of a long, tired day. Light slanted across the ridge and spilled over the low wooden roofs, turning the drifting fine dust into embers that refused to die. In that quiet, so still one could hear the wind scrape across the reins of the horses tied outside the saloon, Evelynne Rhodes stepped down from an old dark brown wagon. The 28-year-old black woman stood there in a simple blue-gray dress, the hem slightly worn, gripping a soft leather bag filled with medical tools. She was someone running from the past, holding on to the last piece of pride she had left. Back east, she had tried to keep a small clinic alive, healing countless people, yet the harsh whispers about her color and her being a woman finally slammed that door shut. She left without a word, and Red Bluff, a red dust town where no one knew her name, became the next place for her life to land. She drew a slow breath, letting the scorched western air fill her lungs. She had already written to the grocer here to rent 2 rooms upstairs, one to live in, one to treat the ailments Western folks liked to ignore until they grew dangerous: fevers, sprains, dislocations, burns, work injuries, falls from horses. She expected no warm welcome, only the chance to work in peace. But that peace never arrived. Hoofbeats thundered from the end of the road. People on the saloon porch turned their heads. A man on a large bay horse staggered into town as if shoved by the wind. The horse breathed hard, foam spraying from its mouth, and the man leaned dangerously to one side, close to falling. Before anyone else could react, Evelynne tightened her grip on her bag and ran toward him. She caught his arm just as he nearly slipped from the saddle. Heat radiated from his skin, a feverish, blistering heat from sunstroke and exhaustion. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice steady and firm. The man lifted his head, eyes blue as metal catching late light. His face was hollowed, jaw set, nose straight, black hair tangled and streaked with desert dust. He tried to steady himself, breath rough, shoulders trembling. His right arm hung at an odd angle. Evelynne touched it, feeling the slight shift in the joint. "You're dislocated," she said quietly, "and badly dehydrated." The nearby onlookers murmured. "Who's she?" "A colored woman. Talking like a doctor? Lord, the times must be changing." The man frowned and leaned back half a step, but dizziness forced him to rest against her shoulder. "I don't need," he began, voice raw. "You do," Evelynne cut in, eyes unflinching. "Sit down." Without waiting for consent, she guided his injured arm into a safer position. When she rotated his wrist to assess it, Jonah Hale, his name whispered among the crowd, drew a sharp breath. Instinctively, his large hand closed around her wrist, a reflex from pain. Both of them stilled. In the red dust and the murmur of voices, there was only his hand around hers, warm, strong, trembling. Evelynne gently released his grip. "It's all right. I'll set it back. But it has to be now." Jonah stared at her as if trying to understand who she was, where she came from, and why a black woman would be so calm before a man his size. "You're," he asked, suspicion in his voice. "Evelynne Rhodes," she said. "I'm a doctor." Silence dropped. A few mocking laughs rose from the saloon porch. Jonah tried to pull away, but the pain kept him still as she set the joint. A small crack sounded, sharp, relieving. His jaw tightened, but his gaze lost its earlier frost. "I'll need to check on your child tomorrow," Evelynne said, her tone light as wind but firm as stone. "What's wrong with him?" Jonah hesitated. then gave a small nod. "Ben's had a fever for 3 days. You can come." No thanks. No warmth. Only the reluctant acceptance of a man who trusted no one, least of all a woman like her. But that invitation was enough to let tomorrow begin to change. The road to the Hale ranch stretched long and gold, like a scarf forgotten across the open grassland. Morning air still held a bite of cold, and the sun had only begun to rise behind the low hills, laying pale light over the thin rows of birch trees. Evelynne Rhodes sat on the small rented wagon, one hand steady on her medical bag, her eyes taking in the strange yet oddly calming landscape. The Hale ranch appeared after a bend, nothing more than a plain 2-story wooden house surrounded by cattle pens, a barn, and a wide yard touched by shade. It wasn't wealthy by any means, but it was built by someone who knew work and respected the land. Still, the place felt hollow. A quiet emptiness hung in the air, as if this was a home meant for living, not laughing. Jonah Hale stood by the fence, fastening the reins of the bay horse. He turned when the wagon approached. His blue eyes held some of yesterday's coldness, but the strain had eased. His right wrist was still wrapped in the cloth she'd bandaged, every movement cautious, telling her the pain lingered. "You're here," Jonah said, voice low, no longer edged like before. He stepped toward the wagon and took her medical bag from her hands. The gesture was simple, yet his grip was steady and warm, and the brief silence between them stretched long enough for her to sense something she couldn't quite name. "Ben's inside," Jonah added, then led the way. Crossing the threshold, Evelynne felt the orderliness of the house and the absence of a woman's touch. Everything was neat, but plain. The fireplace glowed faintly. Smoke threaded through the wooden walls. From the next room came a thin, rough cough. Ben lay on a small bed, blanket pulled up to his chest. His light brown curls were damp with sweat, and his cheeks flushed red with fever. When Evelynne approached, the boy's eyes opened, clear, earnest. Jonah's eyes softened into a child's. "Hello, Ben," she said gently. "I'm Evelynne. I'm here to help you feel better." He nodded, wordless, then coughed again. Her hand touched his forehead, hot, but not dangerously so. "Just a chill," she murmured. "You started coughing last night, didn't you?" Ben nodded again. Jonah stood in the doorway, shoulder braced against the frame, arms folded. He didn't interrupt, just watched every move she made with a focus too sharp to be casual. Part worry, part lingering doubt. Evelynne opened her bag and took out a small pouch of herbs she'd blended herself. "This will steep into a warm drink and bring the fever down. I need hot water." Jonah turned and left without a word, but the speed in his steps showed more than words. Fear for his boy. Sitting beside Ben, she adjusted the blanket and rubbed a light herbal oil across his chest and back. The scent of mint blended with the wood smoke, a warmth settling into the room. "You smell like cinnamon," Ben whispered, voice rasped. She chuckled softly. "Maybe because I had cinnamon tea this morning. You like it?" He nodded, eyelids drooping as comfort sank into him. When she reached for a pillow to raise his head, Jonah had returned and was standing behind her. She turned a bit too quickly, not realizing how close he was. Her hand brushed his elbow, barely a touch. They both froze. It was nothing, a fleeting contact. Yet it made Jonah's jaw tighten and made Evelynne pull back faster than necessary. Silence pressed in, the room seeming smaller for it. "Sorry," she said, gaze shifted aside. It's fine, Jonah answered, voice low, carrying a roughness she hadn't heard from him before. They both turned back to Ben, as though neither wanted to consider the moment any longer. With the warm drink easing Ben's breath and the fever lightening, evening settled outside. The sun dipped low, washing the window in pale orange. Traveling back tonight will be dangerous, Jonah said. The rocks on the ridge get slick after sunset. I have a spare room upstairs, if you don't mind. Evelynne held his gaze for a long second before she nodded. If it helps me stay close to watch over Ben, then I don't mind. Jonah dipped his head, saying nothing more. But the look he gave her as he turned away, quiet, waited, searching, spoke clearly. He was learning to trust her, even if only a little. The first morning at the Hale Ranch opened with the scent of warm wood and dawn mist drifting through the air. As Evelynne stepped down the stairs, the soft pink glow of sunrise slipped through the cracks of the shutters and touched the pale floorboards like a gentle hand. The house was quiet, save for the faint crackle of the fire. She brewed a pot of herbal tea for Ben, her heart easing at the thought of the frail child sleeping peacefully the night before. Ben woke with flushed cheeks and brighter eyes. "Miss Eve," he rasped, voice rough but filled with delight. One night was all it took for him to speak her name as though he had known her for years. Evelynne smiled, sat at the edge of his bed, and laid a hand against his forehead, cool enough to reassure her. "You're better," she said. "You'll feel lighter today." Ben nodded eagerly, then coughed. Jonah stood leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, watching every small movement she made. The suspicion was gone. In its place lingered the reserved quiet of a man not used to letting anyone step into his life. Yet he studied her, not to judge, but to understand. All day, Ben needed only rest, warm tea, and light broth. By noon, he refused to let Evelynne out of his sight. When she washed dishes, Ben followed. When she mixed herbs, he stood beside her. When she stepped outside to hang cloths to dry, he perched on the porch steps, watching. The boy's attachment warmed her more than she allowed herself to admit. Jonah kept to his labor around the ranch, mending fences, checking the stables, stacking hay. But each time Evelynne lifted her gaze, she caught his eyes somewhere nearby, on the porch, at the well, behind a window, vanishing as quickly as if he had just looked away. At midday, one of the ranch hands, Hank, slipped and twisted his ankle while driving cattle across the creek. Jonah brought him in, and Evelynne immediately knelt to examine the swollen joint. Hank grimaced when she rotated it. "Just a sprain," she said, her tone sure. "I'll wrap it. Go easy on the foot for a few days." When she tightened the bandage, Hank exhaled. "You've got a good hand, miss. Odd how it hardly hurts." Jonah stood close by, arms folded, blue eyes shifting, not distrust this time, but something that looked like dawning trust. By late afternoon, Jonah sat on the porch cleaning his saddle. Evelynne brought him a cup of warm water in a tin mug. He took it, and for a fleeting moment, his gaze softened. "Ben's doing better," she said. Jonah nodded. "He falls sick easy. Ever since his mother passed, I haven't known what to do." The words slipped out, as if they had been kept too long. Evelynne sat beside him, their shoulders separated by only a small span of air. He went on, voice low. "Sarah was weak even before he was born, and when Ben turned 5, the Lord didn't spare her." "You don't have to speak of it if it pains you," Evelynne murmured. "I'm not hurt by telling it," Jonah said, eyes fixed on the open field. "I'm hurt because every time Ben burns with fever, I fear losing him too." The confession dropped heavy as dusk. Evelynne set her hand over his for the briefest moment, just long enough for him to know she understood, then drew it back. Then she spoke of her own life, the small clinic back east, the scornful stares, the whispered slurs. The last morning she realized she could no longer fight alone. Jonah didn't interrupt once, and when she finished, he simply said, "They didn't deserve you." Night brought stronger wind. One lamp in the kitchen flickered, then went out. When Evelynne checked the wick, Jonah stepped behind her, shielding the flame from the draft with his hand. They stood close, close enough that she felt the warmth of his breath, slow and steady. She looked up just as he looked down. Their eyes met, longer than needed, long enough to unsettle her heartbeat. Evelynne blinked, breaking the tension. "Thank you," she said softly. Jonah stepped back half a pace as though afraid of crossing a line. "It's nothing," he said, though his voice no longer held its usual steadiness. They each turned back to their tasks, trying to hide the unease rising inside them. But through the rest of the evening, every time Evelynne walked past Jonah, the air between them stirred, light, charged, as if something unnamed was quietly taking shape. The morning Evelynne left the Hale ranch was so clear, the distant hills looked as though they'd been traced by a fine, steady hand. She carried her medical bag, a few bundles of herbs Jonah had asked Eduardo to gather, and Ben's hoarse reminder, "Come back, Miss Eve. Promise." His voice still rough from the cold, but his eyes bright like water after rain. As she climbed onto the wagon, she glanced back. Jonah stood on the porch, one hand resting on Ben's shoulder. He said nothing, but the slow nod he gave her sent a small, unfamiliar beat through her chest. Red Bluff welcomed her with its familiar noise, the clatter of wagons, boots on wood planks, and the dry gold dust that had its own scent. When she stepped into Mr. Jenkins's general store, the man who agreed to rent her 2 rooms upstairs, he offered a cautious smile. "Your rooms are ready, Miss Rhodes," he said. "And the folks in town, well, they've started talking about you." "Good talk or bad, Mr. Jenkins?" "That depends on who's telling it." He gave a thin chuckle. "Mostly curious, I'd say. We've never had a doctor like you out here." The words were plain, honest. Evelynne only nodded. "I'll handle the rest." The rooms upstairs were brighter than she expected. Clean, simple, touched by late morning light. She spent hours arranging jars, tools, herbs, and the few medical books she carried west. When she hung the hand-painted sign reading, "Evelynne Rhodes, Care and Simple Treatment," a breeze drifted through the stairwell. Light, almost hopeful. Word about the black woman who fixed Jonah Hale's boy overnight spread quicker than the smell of Mrs. Peterson's sausage stew. Early afternoon, the first knock came. It was Hank, the ranch hand she had wrapped a sprained ankle for. "My back's gone wrong on me," he groaned. Lifted a new anvil and heard a crack. Evelynne had him lie on the wooden cot and worked the tight muscle with warm herbal oil. Hank gritted his teeth, then sighed. "Your hands. Soft but firm. Strange how that helps." As he left, several townsfolk outside watched him go. Soon after, Lily, the saloon keeper, arrived, wrist wrapped in a makeshift cloth. "Dropped a bottle on myself," she muttered. "Heard you know what you're doing." Evelynne checked the wrist. "Just a light sprain. Avoid lifting things for a bit." After Lily came the carpenter's little girl, burning with a small fever from being caught in the rain. Evelynne gave her herbs, cool cloths, and gentle instructions. One by one they left with new stories to carry, and those stories drifted through Red Bluff like morning mist, soft, quiet, but lingering. By late afternoon, while Evelynne was sealing her medicine jars, familiar footsteps sounded outside. Ben ran in first, clutching a bundle of wildflowers, yellow, purple, blue. "For you," he said, dropping them on her table. A smile broke across Evelynne's face, bright and unrestrained, like a light she hadn't meant to let show. Jonah stepped inside behind his son and froze for a heartbeat when he saw that smile. Just half a second, but enough for Evelynne to sense a shift in him, slow but sure, like desert earth taking in water. "Does your wrist still hurt?" she asked. Jonah hesitated, then extended his right hand. "Better, still stiff." Evelynne stepped closer, closer than she meant to. When her fingers touched his wrist, the space left between them was only breath. Her touch was practical, careful, but the moment stretched longer than it should have. Jonah looked down, his blue gaze meeting her dark, steady eyes. "The joint's still tight," she said, keeping her voice even. "I'll loosen it." Her small hand closed around his wrist. Jonah stayed still, so still it felt like he feared any movement would betray the stir beneath his ribs. Beside them, Ben examined his flowers, blissfully unaware that the grown-ups were holding their breaths over something they couldn't name. When she released his wrist, Jonah drew a faint, quiet breath, as though he had forgotten to take one. "Thank you," he said, voice dropped low. Evelynne only nodded, looking away. But inside her, a thin thread had settled, soft, slight, but not easily broken. By late October, Red Bluff seemed to step into a new skin. Gold leaves lined both sides of the main road, bundles of hay stacked neatly at every doorstep, and the scent of baked apples and pumpkin pie drifted on the wind, slipping through every wooden crack. The town was preparing for the autumn festival, the biggest gathering of the year, when everyone came together to dance, eat, and forget, for one evening, the harshness of this land. That afternoon, while Evelynne was arranging her herb jars, a knock sounded at the door. She looked up and didn't expect to see Jonah there in a clean shirt, hair combed, blue eyes darker than usual. "Are you busy?" he asked, voice gentler than it had ever been. Evelynne set the jar down. "Just finished. What is it?" Jonah stood still for a few seconds, as if gathering courage from somewhere far inside. "The festival tonight. Would you come with me and Ben?" The question struck her silent for a breath. Then she saw it, the faint flicker in his eyes, the kind that told her if she refused, he would retreat again into a place she would never reach. "Yes," she said, soft but sure. "I'd like that." When Jonah and Ben returned to fetch her, dusk had already settled. Evelynne stepped down the stairs in a deep blue dress that moved like nightfall, the waist drawn in, the neckline modest but graceful. Her curls were gathered and tied with a pale ribbon, leaving the curve of her neck exposed. Ben's mouth fell open, and Jonah simply forgot to breathe. The warm light from the clinic lantern brushed her dark skin, making her look like a small flame glowing on its own. "You look beautiful," Jonah said quietly, almost under his breath. Evelynne smiled, the kind of smile that softened the corners of her eyes, and Jonah froze for half a moment. The festival was more crowded than she expected. As Jonah led her inside the hall, the first head to turn was Lily from the saloon, then Hank the blacksmith, then a row of men standing by the pumpkin pies. Anyone who saw them, Jonah walking beside Evelynne, paused. A man known for shutting himself off after his wife passed, walking beside a black woman. Not just walking, standing close. Whispers rose lightly, but Evelynne felt no unease. With Jonah beside her, she felt a steady wall of quiet strength. Ben ran off to meet his friends, leaving the two adults to step into the lamplight alone, unaware of how many eyes trailed them. Music swelled, violins, mandolin strings, the soft pulse of drums. When the waltz began, Jonah turned to her. "Would you dance with me?" Evelynne let out a small laugh. "You know how to dance?" "Not well," Jonah admitted. "But Sarah, my wife, made me learn a little." He said her name gently now, without the weight it once carried. Evelynne extended her hand, a simple gesture warmed by something quiet. "Then lead me." Jonah set his hand at her back, light, careful, as if he feared he might hurt her. She rested her palm on his shoulder and felt his warmth through the fabric. They moved into the slow waltz, nothing elaborate, just two people keeping time with each other. But the small space between them made both their hearts stumble. Jonah's eyes stayed on hers through the whole song, not the searching look from their first days, not the wary one either, but the look of a man who, for the first time in years, allowed his heart to turn towards someone again. When the music died away, Jonah spoke softly. "After Sarah passed, I thought my heart died with her. I didn't think it could open again." Evelynne held his gaze, her voice low but steady. "The heart doesn't die, Jonah. It just fears hurting again." He stayed silent for a while, then said, barely above a whisper, "I'm afraid. But when I look at you, I don't want to run anymore." The air thickened around them, as if the whole hall had narrowed to just the two of them. On the way back to her clinic, the night grew colder, thin mist gathering over the rooftops. A gust loosened the shawl on her shoulders. Evelynne reached to catch it, but Jonah stepped forward first. "Let me." He adjusted the shawl, his touch feather light. When his fingers brushed the bare skin at her neck, only for a heartbeat, both of them stilled. A long silence followed, soft and deep like the night itself. Jonah drew his hand back slowly, and Evelynne stood holding the shawl he had just set in place. No more words were spoken. But both of them knew something had shifted forever. That night, the wind shifted strangely. Far out over the hills, gray clouds crawled low like creatures searching for a way into town. Red Bluff fell into a stillness so sharp, it felt like the land was holding its breath. Evelynne was gathering her medicine jars when a hard, hurried knocking struck the door, urgent enough for her to know something was wrong. When she opened it, Jonah stood there, breath uneven, coat dusted, blue eyes marked with fear. "Ben's been coughing for an hour," he said. "His breathing's heavy. I need you." She didn't hesitate. Evelynne snatched up her bag, pulled on her coat, and followed him into the dark. The wind sliced cold against her face. The night so black the lantern Jonah carried became their only guide. The two shapes, one tall, one small, moved across the grass and dirt path toward the ranch. Inside, Ben lay curled under his blanket. He tried to sit up when he saw Evelynne, but the cough shook his thin body. "Miss Eve," he whispered. "It's all right, sweetheart," Evelynne said, sitting beside him, her hand warm on his shoulder. "The wind's cold tonight. I'll help." She lit a handful of herbs to warm the room, brewed a cup of hot tea, and rubbed oil along Ben's back in small circles. Heat spread through him, easing each breath. Jonah stood in the doorway, hands knotted tightly, too afraid to interrupt. Only when Evelynne gave him a quiet nod did he step forward to hold a towel for her. After half an hour, Ben's breathing softened. His eyes fluttered, then closed, and he slipped into a calm, steady sleep. Evelynne covered him gently and rose. Jonah stepped aside to let her pass, but the nearness of it left only half a breath between them. Her heart shifted in her chest. "Thank you," Jonah said softly. "If it weren't for you—" "You don't need to say that," she answered. "He just caught the cold wind. He'll be fine." But his gaze didn't ease. It deepened, warmer, steadier, and she looked away before it could cut too close. Jonah led her to the sitting room. The fireplace burned bright, casting soft gold over his face and softening the edges of his features. "Please," Jonah said, pulling a chair closer. But when she sat, a draft swept through the window, and she shivered lightly. Jonah immediately took off his coat and settled it around her shoulders. When his hand brushed her wrist, Evelynne went still. It was only a passing touch, yet it carried a kind of care he no longer bothered to hide, leaving her unsure whether to step back or stay. "Thank you," she murmured. They sat before the fire, two people who had been lonely for too long. The flames clicked softly, the smell of burning pine drifting through the room. Outside the wind howled, but in that small space warmth rose like water filling a basin. "Since Sarah died," Jonah said slowly, "this house has felt empty as a barn in dry season. I lived without really, living." Evelynne lowered her eyes to her hands. "I know that feeling, when the past hangs over you like a shadow that won't step aside." Jonah turned toward her. "Tonight, when I came knocking, I realized I'd been trusting you longer than I knew." The words softened the room to something almost fragile. Evelynne started to speak, but a spark from the fire snapped, sending a fleck of ash onto Jonah's shirt. She reached instinctively to brush it away, her fingers landing just above his collarbone. For a moment, time stretched, her hand on his chest, his breath touching her cheek, neither one pulling away. "Evelynne," Jonah said, barely above a whisper. She lifted her eyes. Their gazes locked. No hesitation now, no hiding. Something they had both held back swelled between them, full to the brim. Jonah leaned down first, slow, asking without words. Evelynne closed her eyes and met him halfway. Their first kiss wasn't hurried. It asked for nothing. It felt like two people resting their foreheads together at the end of a long day, gentle, quiet, sustained by breath alone. Then Jonah's hand rose to her cheek, and Evelynne's hand pressed lightly against his chest. Warm, solid, alive. When they parted, they drew soft breaths, as though rediscovering something lost long ago. Jonah pulled her into his arms. Evelynne rested her forehead against his shoulder and listened to the steady beat of his heart. Simple, earthly, enduring. No words, no demands. Just two hearts opening on a cold night, finding each other in the silence. Morning at the Hale Ranch always began with the scent of warm wood and the soft brush of wind along the roof. But that morning, everything felt gentler, quieter. Or perhaps it was Evelynne herself who felt that way. When she opened her eyes, the early light slipped through the cracks in the shutters, thin and clear as a first breath. She rose slowly, draped a light shawl over her shoulders, and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was the same as ever. Tidy, plain, a few bowls turned upside down on the rack. Evelynne kindled the stove, set water to boil, and crushed ginger on the wooden block. The steady rhythm of the pestle rang softly, not loud, but rounded like the beat of her own heart, calm on the outside, yet carrying an undercurrent that hadn't settled since last night. She didn't want to dwell on it, didn't want to name it too soon. But Jonah's arms from the night before still lingered faintly on her skin like the last warmth of a fading fire. As she stirred the ginger tea, footsteps sounded behind her, not heavy but familiar enough that she knew who it was. Jonah appeared at the kitchen doorway, his shadow long across the floor, familiar and yet strangely like a man just returned from a long road. He stood there a few seconds, shoulder leaning against the frame. Morning light outlined the sharp lines of his face, but his eyes were different, softer, deeper, as if something new had taken shape between them, though both were still pretending not to see it. "You're up early," Jonah said, voice low and rough, whether from the cold or something else she couldn't tell. "Ben needs warm ginger tea when he wakes," Evelynne answered, her voice steady though her pulse stumbled once. "I didn't want him waiting." Jonah nodded and stepped into the kitchen. He didn't touch her, didn't stand too close, but the space between them was small enough for his warmth to drift toward her like a thin wisp of smoke. "Did you sleep well?" he asked quietly. Evelynne paused, only for a breath. "Well enough." They both knew that wasn't entirely true. Nothing was simple after leaning into each other by the fire. But they each held the words close, as though speaking them aloud would make everything too real, too soon. Jonah reached for a cup just as Evelynne reached for a wooden ladle. Their fingers brushed, only a whisper of contact, but enough to freeze them both. "Sorry," she murmured. "No," Jonah said, shaking his head, his gaze lingering a moment longer than it should on her hand. "My fault." He stepped back, but the awkwardness on his face was almost disarming. A man who had weathered sandstorms, desert winds, loss and loneliness, now standing uncertain in his own kitchen because his hand had touched that of a woman. The tea had just turned warm enough when a small sound came from Ben's room. Evelynne picked up the cup and went first. Jonah followed, a few steps slower, as though he needed time to steady whatever had stirred inside him. Ben was awake, hair rumpled, eyes sleepy but brightening at the sight of her. "Miss Eve," he rasped, soft but full of delight. Evelynne sat beside him, touching his forehead. "You're better." Ben nodded, then leaned close to whisper, "Did you stay here last night?" She smiled. "You were coughing, so I stayed to watch you." Ben hugged her, quickly, as if he knew too long a hug might earn Jonah's attention. Jonah stood at the doorway, his expression loosening as he watched his son. That small picture, an ill child waking, a woman smiling beside him, sunlight pooling in the room, the boy's small hand resting over hers, left Jonah wordless. He only looked on, still, as though seeing something his home had been missing for years. Evelynne offered Ben small sips of tea. Jonah sat in the chair beside the bed, glancing at her now and then, no longer hiding the look. Each time she caught it, her heart tightened slightly, uncertain whether out of warmth or fear. When Ben drifted back to sleep, Evelynne rose to tidy her things. "I should go before the sun climbs too high." Jonah followed her to the porch. They stopped on the steps, morning wind whispering through the trees. "Thank you," Jonah said, "for last night, for this morning, for everything." Evelynne held his gaze for a moment, then answered simply, "Caring for Ben is something I choose to do. You don't need to thank me." But Jonah didn't look away. It isn't just Ben. Her heart trembled again, a light, true beat. She stepped onto the wagon. Jonah handed her the reins and his fingers brushed hers once more. Neither pulled back right away. The moment was brief, but it held the depth of a shadow cast at midday. Evelynne took the reins, eyes turning forward, but her voice, when it came, was softer than usual. "I'll come back to check on Ben." "And I'll be waiting," Jonah said, his voice steady and low, not urgent, not demanding, just an honest truth released from somewhere deep. As the wagon began to move, Evelynne looked back. Jonah still stood there in the early light, tall and still, his hands at his sides, but his gaze fixed on the place where she had been. Evelynne pressed a hand gently over her chest, where her heart drummed fast beneath her palm. A quiet gladness, a deep tremor, and something taking shape inside her, enough to make her both afraid and hopeful. Winter came to the Arizona territory not with northern bitterness, but with sudden winds that shifted without warning, carrying thin mountain mist across the plains. In early December, just as Evelynne was growing used to her weekly visits to the Hale Ranch, the sky over Red Bluff turned heavy, white clouds stacking thick on thick. The oldest townsfolk exchanged wary looks. "Snowstorm," Jenkins muttered as Evelynne was closing her clinic. "This kind hits fast. Anyone still out on the range is in trouble." Her heart tightened. Jonah had told her that morning he was riding out to check the cattle on the east slope. Steep ground, slick with the first thin frost. Cold wind struck her face, but the worry cut sharper. By late afternoon, the snow came, hard, sudden, blinding, as if the sky meant to swallow the whole land. Evelynne stood in her doorway, staring down the road leading toward the Hale Ranch. A heavy dread tightened inside her, like a rope pulled notch by notch. The door flew open. Ben stumbled in, cheeks red from wind, breath broken. "Miss Eve!" he cried. "Pa, he ain't back. His horse ran home without him. There was blood on its leg. Pa fell, Miss Eve." For one long second, the world went silent. Only the wind's howl and her own racing heart remained. "Ben, breathe," she said, kneeling and gripping his shoulders. "Where did he fall?" "East slope, near the tree line. I'm scared." She pulled him inside, left him with Mrs. Peterson, then ran to the general store. "Jenkins, I need riders." Her voice shook in a way she couldn't hide. "Jonah's hurt. If we don't go now, he'll freeze out there." She didn't need to say more. 3 men rose at once: Hank the blacksmith, Tom from a nearby ranch, and Jenkins himself. They grabbed lanterns, rope, a thick blanket, and followed her into the white storm. They rode into wind that roared like a wild beast. Snow stung their faces raw, each step sinking deep into the cold, white drift. Evelynne rode with numb hands gripping the reins, fear clawing through her chest. The lanterns swung, their light beaten down by the storm. "This way!" she shouted, Ben's directions still ringing in her mind. "East slope!" At a slanted patch of ground, Tom stopped cold. "Tracks here. Someone slipped." Evelynne was off her horse before anyone else moved. At her feet lay a long, deep slide mark in the snow, hoofprints scattered wild, and farther down, beneath a small pine, a fallen body. "Jonah!" she cried, her voice breaking against the storm. She ran, dropped to her knees. Jonah lay on his side, snow crusting his hair, his face pale as if drained of life. His coat was torn at the leg. One look told her the truth. The limb was swollen, twisted, likely a severe sprain or worse. But what froze her was his breathing, thin, faint, barely there. "Jonah! Jonah, can you hear me?" His hand was ice, lifeless cold. Her eyes burned, but she steadied her voice. She leaned over him, shielding him from the knife-hard wind. She pulled him into her arms, feeling the winter in his bones seep into her own. "Don't you leave me. Don't you dare," she whispered through chattering teeth. She cupped her hand around his face, pressing her forehead to his, trying to give him what little warmth she had left. Hank and Tom spread the blanket and lifted Jonah with care. Evelynne held his head to her shoulder, letting him rest against her all the way home. Wind slapped the blanket. Jonah groaned each time the horse jolted, and each time she tightened her arms around him as if her strength alone could keep him alive. By the time they reached Red Bluff, night had swallowed the town. Evelynne's clinic glowed warm, windows thrown open. Mrs. Peterson held a sobbing Ben on her lap. They laid Jonah on the clinic bed. His breath was weak, but steadier. She pulled off his frozen coat, covered him in thick blankets, and worked over his injured leg with trembling hands. "You'll be all right," she whispered, uncertain if she was speaking to Jonah or to her own aching fear. "You'll be all right. I won't lose you." Outside, the snowstorm kept its wild cry. But inside the warm-lit room, Evelynne held Jonah's cold hand in her warm one and didn't let go for a single second. The wind outside still scraped against the clinic roof like a storm trumpet, refusing to quiet. But inside the small room, warm lamplight fell over the pale face of Jonah Hale. He lay there, broad-shouldered yet strangely fragile, his breath uneven, his cheeks marked by the cold that had cut across him in the blizzard. Evelynne bent beside the bed, checking his leg once more. The ankle was swollen and red, warm with inflammation, but still responsive, his pulse slow, steady. She exhaled, half relieved, half worried. A heavy sprain, maybe deeper strain, but not life-threatening if treated right. She placed her warm hand on his ankle, working hot oil into the skin. Even that small touch made Jonah groan, his brow tightening. Evelynne paused a beat. "Sorry," she said quietly. "It'll hurt a little, but it'll ease soon." Jonah's eyes opened, slow, clouded with exhaustion, yet unmistakably human. He tried to lift his hand, but he was too weak, managing only a few inches. Evelynne reached for it at once. "I'm here," she murmured. "Just rest." But Jonah shook his head faintly, his breath warm and thin against her wrist. "Don't go," he whispered, each word scraped from deep inside him. Evelynne went still. His grip wasn't strong, but it held her with the weight of a man clinging to the last thing anchoring him to this world. She leaned closer, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "I'm not leaving. I'm right here." Jonah closed his eyes, as though those words alone kept him from slipping away. "Miss Eve, is Pa okay?" Ben's small voice rose from the foot of the bed. The boy had fallen asleep waiting, but was now forcing his eyes open. His hands clutched the blanket as though letting go would break him. Evelynne brushed a hand over his hair. "He's all right, just cold and hurt, but he'll recover." Ben drew a tense breath, nodded once and tried to say more, only to fall asleep again, leaning against the side of the bed. Evelynne pulled a blanket over him. A small family, shaken, but trying to piece itself back together with the only tenderness they had. Her gaze lingered on the sight of father and son lying close. Ben's thin arm wrapped around Jonah's, and Jonah, half-conscious, still holding Evelynne's hand. Her chest tightened with something she didn't dare name, Near midnight, the storm eased, but inside the clinic Evelynne had not moved far. She sat on the chair beside the bed, shawl wrapped tight. Every few minutes, she checked Jonah's temperature, changed the warm cloth on his forehead, then looked over at Ben to make sure he slept deeply. When Jonah shifted or groaned, Evelynne bent close, listening for the steadiness of his breath. Each time she rose for ginger tea or to warm another cloth, Jonah's hand opened, seeking, and every time she placed hers back into his. No promises, no words, just a quiet holding that spoke deeper than anything they could have said. She looked toward the small oil lamp burning low on the table. Its flame cast her shadow on the wall, long, trembling. And memories of her lonely nights back east rose up, nights spent fighting prejudice alone, nights bracing herself against scorn simply for being a woman, and a black one. For the first time in a long winter, she wasn't completely alone. Evelynne brushed a strand of damp hair from Jonah's forehead and whispered, her voice a soft wind, "You have to stay, for Ben, and for everything we haven't said." Jonah didn't answer, but his lashes trembled, as if he heard. Toward dawn, Ben shifted, his hand still clasped around his father's. His breathing was steady again. Evelynne glanced at both of them, then leaned back in her chair. Her eyelids grew heavy, Jonah's hand still warm around her wrist. And at last, she slipped into sleep. In a room filled with 3 resting breaths, each one reaching for the others in different ways, each one quiet and earnest as a shared prayer. Snow always melts slower than folks would like, but it melts all the same, much like the things inside a person that need time before they soften. A few weeks after the storm, Red Bluff began slipping free of its white shell. The ground turned wet and loose, showing patches of brown grass waking from a hard winter. Jonah Hale did the same. He healed bit by bit. First, the trembling eased when he stood. Then came careful, steady steps across the floor. Each day he returned to the clinic for new bandages, less the man hunched against pain and cold, more a man opening the doors of his heart, slow but honest, gentle as morning after thaw. And this morning, he came earlier than usual. Evelynne was sweeping the fine dust off the porch when she heard that familiar, uneven step. She looked up to find Jonah standing there, leaning on the wooden cane Jenkins had made. The sky was pale blue behind him, his face brightened by the rare winter light. "You're earlier than I expected," she said, trying to mask the stir inside her. "Ben told me last night the weather'd be good today," Jonah answered. "Said I ought to come early and get some kind of vitamin out of it." He smiled, a smile rare enough that every time it appeared, it unsettled her the same way it had the first day she met him. "Ben talks like a grown man now," she said. "Maybe because he's around you," Jonah replied, flat and simple. Then, seeing her turn slightly aside, he added, "That's a compliment." She pretended to fuss with her sleeve. "I know." They sat on the porch steps. From there, they could see the main road, small puddles catching the sky, a few bold birds swooping down for whatever the winter had spared. Jonah leaned on his cane, angled slightly toward her. His breath was steady now, though his voice carried something deeper, as if the blizzard had shown him the edge of life and left him with a quiet gratitude he didn't know how to speak. "These past weeks," he began, then paused, brow furrowed as if searching for the right words. "I've been thinking a lot." "About walking again?" Evelynne asked, trying to steer away from the feeling rising inside her. "Your leg still isn't fully healed." Jonah shook his head, his blue eyes locking onto hers. No, about us. Evelynne stilled. There was no pretending she didn't understand. A light wind carried the smell of damp earth. She straightened, her heart beating like a soft drum beneath her ribs. Jonah, that's... He raised a hand gently, stopping her from hiding behind her usual cautions. Evelynne, words never came easy for me, but I know this. When I was buried under the snow, the only thought in my mind was, I hadn't told you what I should have said long before. She looked down at her gloves. Jonah, you were sick. Emotions get tangled when people are scared. It wasn't fear, Jonah said at once, voice low but certain. It was because I saw you, clearer than I've ever seen anyone. She lifted her gaze. Jonah went on, slow, deliberate. I want you at the ranch, not to tend Ben, not to help with chores, but because I want you beside me. Her heart turned as if held in someone's hand. Jonah, she clasped her fingers together. What about the clinic? You know how hard I fought to build it here. Jonah nodded without hesitation. I know, and I don't want to take anything from you. He looked off toward the trail leading to the Hale ranch, his voice mellowing like late afternoon sun. There's an old storage house on the east side of the ranch. Walls are still good. If we fix it up, it could be a small clinic for folks who live too far to reach town. You could help them. Evelynne stared at him, for once without words. Jonah's next words came slower, each one a step farther into the quiet places of her heart. I don't want to hold you back. I want to build something you can stand on, while staying close to me. A light gust blew past, tumbling the last bits of snow across the ground. The silence grew soft enough that their breaths seemed louder than the wind. At some point, Jonah's hand had come to rest on the wooden step beside hers, near, but not touching, like an invitation spoken without a sound. Their eyes found each other, and this time neither looked away. No hiding, no halfway things. Not a loud confession, just truth revealed after a long winter. Evelynne's voice shook as she whispered, You're serious about this? With you, Jonah answered. I've never been anything but serious. She drew a slow breath. She didn't know if it was fear, joy, or both entwined until they couldn't be told apart. But when she lifted her head, her eyes held a quiet light, a light that didn't go out easily. I'll think about it, she said, though she didn't break his gaze. Jonah nodded. No pressure, no demand. Take your time, he said softly. As long as you stay here beside me a while longer. And they sat like that, not touching, but close enough to feel each other's warmth in the morning after the snow had melted. Spring came back to Red Bluff without noise. It arrived in thin sunlight slipping through gray clouds, in the warm rise of earth under passing boots, in the soft breath of a thawed creek. At the Hale Ranch, spring always lagged a little behind the town, but when it came, the whole place felt as though it had opened its eyes after a long sleep. And in that same spring, Evelynne Rhodes began riding to the ranch more often. Not just to check Jonah's leg, not just because Ben lit up every time he saw her, but because with every visit, her heart grew less afraid, less willing to deny what was quietly rising between two people who once thought they had no place left to trust. Most mornings, she rode the small brown horse Jonah had loaned her, crossing the now dry road. When she arrived, Jonah was usually on the porch already, leaning on his cane but standing firm. He never smiled wide, only tipped his head slightly, but that small tilt made his blue eyes catch light in a way she could not ignore. Once a gust tangled her scarf. While she tried to fix it, Jonah stepped behind her, his warm hand settling on her shoulder. "Let me," he said, voice low as earth after rain. His fingers brushed her neck as he retied the scarf, soft enough to still her breath for half a second. His warm breath touched her cheek, close, familiar in a way she barely dared to admit. Moments like that came often. Small but long, moments when time slowed so the heart could hear itself. Ben noticed, too. A 10-year-old with sharper eyes than folks gave him credit for. One afternoon, Jonah helped Evelynne off the horse, both hands around her waist because the step was high. She hadn't even steadied herself when she saw Ben standing by the barn door, arms crossed like an old ranch foreman. "Pa," Ben said, "Miss Eve don't need 2 hands to get down." Jonah flushed, rare enough that Evelynne had to bite back a laugh. Ben shook his head. "Grown-ups are strange." Then he ran off, mission accomplished. Each week, Evelynne brought fresh herbs to the ranch. She sat with Ben in the kitchen, teaching him to sort leaves, while Jonah sat near the window, cane by his knee, watching them with a look that told her he once believed he'd never have anything like this again. Some afternoons they walked the fields so Jonah could practice stepping steady. Evelynne kept close, ready to catch him if he faltered, and every time he braced a hand on her shoulder, something tilted inside her, like grass bending beneath spring wind. And then the day came. The day her heart stopped running. That evening, the 3 of them walked the back field. Ben ran ahead, picking small purple wildflowers for the glass jar he called his spring bottle. Jonah moved slower, Evelynne beside him. Spring wind carried the scent of damp earth and wild grass, lifting the hem of her dark blue dress. At the ridge where the sun poured gold over the land, Jonah stopped. He looked at her, long, steady, and though he said nothing, his eyes held everything. Then, as though the fear of the past months had eased in the warm air, Jonah held out his hand. Evelynne looked at it, then at his face, angular, once distant, now open in a way she could almost reach. She placed her hand in his, warm, large, closing gently around her fingers. Jonah tightened his hold, as if asking a question without words. Evelynne drew a breath. Her heart raced, not with fear now, but with a clear decision rising right to the edge of her voice. "Jonah," she said, quiet but sure, "I've thought long enough." He waited. No push, no pressure, just the patience he had given her all these weeks. Evelynne looked toward Ben running through the grass, then back to Jonah. "And I realized," her voice trembling with happiness drawing near, "I want to walk toward wherever your eyes are looking." Jonah didn't move. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then his eyes warmed in a way that stole her breath. He pulled her close, but still slow, still giving her space to pull away if she wished. She didn't. Instead, Evelynne set her hand on his chest, feeling a strong, steady heartbeat. Jonah lowered his head. Their kiss wasn't rushed or storm-born. It was deep, warm, full as a spring finally spoken aloud. The wind moved around them, lifting her hair, brushing his coat, carrying the smell of new earth and wildflowers. From a distance, Ben shouted, "Pa, Miss Eve! Oh boy, I'm not looking!" Evelynne laughed into the kiss. Jonah did too, his forehead resting against hers, the sound rough with joy. But neither let go. There was no longer any reason to. That spring, Evelynne Rhodes found more than a land where she could heal others. She found the place her own heart meant to stay. That summer came early, carrying warm gold light and soft wind sweeping along the porches of Red Bluff, as if the day itself knew something important was about to happen. The town was lively, though never loud, the easy, neighborly kind of excitement found only in the West, where everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew today was the day Evelynne Rhodes, the black woman who had healed half the county, would become the wife of Jonah Hale. The small church in Red Bluff was dressed with wildflowers gathered from the valley. No fancy ribbons, no bright lanterns, only clusters of purple, yellow, and white blooms placed in simple glass jars, enough to make the place look like a summer morning blooming into life. Evelynne stepped inside wearing a plain dress she had sewn herself, pale as early-day cloud. Her hair was pinned high, adorned with a single sprig of wild grass Ben had picked for her before the ceremony. Not a luxurious bouquet, just the gift of a child for the woman he had begun to call, with new and quiet devotion, Mama Eve. Ben stood before Jonah as the small, best man. His vest hung a little too big, as if trying to swallow him whole, but his face shone with so much pride he looked like he was leading the whole service. When Evelynne entered, Ben looked at her, then at Jonah, his eyes bright as lantern glass. "Pa, she looks like an angel." Jonah bent down, straightened his boy's collar, and rested a hand on his head. "She does." But his gaze drifted toward Evelynne and stayed there long enough to stop time cold. The ceremony was short. Reverend Sherman spoke a few lines about trust, about healing born from small mercies, and then asked, "Jonah Hale, do you take—" Jonah didn't wait for him to finish. "I do." Soft laughter rose through the pews. When it was Evelynne's turn, the Reverend's voice gentled. "Evelynne Rhodes, do you choose to walk beside Jonah in all seasons?" "I do," she said, her eyes held on Jonah. Nothing more was needed. When they exchanged rings, Ben stood on tiptoe to see every detail, his hands fixed together as if holding something sacred. Applause filled the church as Jonah bowed his head and kissed his bride's forehead, light as a prayer of thanks for the woman brought into his life. Afterward, the whole town gathered around long tables set outside the church. There was Mrs. Peterson's apple pie, Gus the blacksmith's roast, and simple dishes from the families scattered around Red Bluff. Folks stopped by with their blessings. "Miss Evelynne's a blessing to this town." "Hale, you're a lucky man." Ben ran circles around everyone, telling whoever would listen, "I got a mother now, Mama Eve." No one had the heart to quiet him. Married life didn't change Evelynne and Jonah overnight. It simply grew fuller, warmer. Evelynne ran 2 clinics, one in town, another small room at the Hale Ranch, just as Jonah had promised. She went back and forth, tending fevers, easing strains, binding the scrapes Ben collected while learning to ride. Jonah healed completely, with only a small ache left for cold weather. His stride grew firm again, solid as before the snowstorm. The ranch prospered, cattle strong, the fields improved, and in each task, Evelynne saw the same truth. The man who once kept to himself now opened his heart the way a house opens after a long winter. As for Ben, the boy who once clung to his father as if to the whole world, now spent his afternoons racing barefoot through the yard, so joyful even the clouds seemed to slow and watch. One evening at sunset, Evelynne and Jonah stood on the porch, the air thick with the scent of wild grass and pine. Below them, Ben chased a few hens the Navajo neighbor had brought over. The sight of the boy running barefoot across the yard made Evelynne laugh under her breath. "A real family now," she murmured, the words meant mostly for herself. Jonah took her hand, the same hand that had trembled during the storm, that had reached for him in the dark, and that now rested warm and steady like the trunk of an old tree. "You came to Red Bluff to heal folks," he said, his voice low with meaning. Then he leaned in, brushing his lips lightly against her hair. "And I found healing." Evelynne rested her head against his shoulder. The red-gold sunset spilled over them, over their small house, over the boy laughing in the yard, marking a promise as simple as it was deep. They had found where they belonged. Not because the land was easy, but because their hearts had finally recognized one another. If you, who have lived through many seasons, find a piece of your own story in theirs, we invite you to share a few lines below. A memory, a lesson, or simply a feeling. It may warm the next traveler who stops by. And if you cherish gentle Wild West love stories like this one, please like the video, follow the channel, and leave a comment. Your support helps us keep telling these stories for seasoned hearts. We'll see you in the next one.